Adeline Whitmore stood alone at the altar of St. Augustine's in Boston, while 300 of the city's oldest fortunes watched her groom fail to appear. She was 26, a community nurse who'd traded medical school for double shifts to keep her sick father out of debt and their name out of the papers, and she'd agreed to this arranged marriage as the only way to save him. Now the string quartet had looped the same prelude 4 times. The whispers were rising like water, and the man she was supposed to marry had already left for a private jet at Logan without so much as a goodbye. Then the cathedral's heavy doors opened, not with wind or thunder, but with the flat, deliberate sound of leather shoes on marble, and every powerful head in that room turned and went still. The man who walked in wasn't there to apologize for the coward who'd run. He was there to collect something that had belonged to him since before Adeline was born. Roman Vance was 37, tall and unhurried, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most of the guests earned in a year, and there was nothing warm in the way he moved. 4 of his men had already sealed every exit without a single word. Boston's aging billionaires knew exactly who he was, and one by one they lowered their eyes, because you didn't meet the gaze of a man who could make people disappear while the police found reasons not to look. He walked straight down the aisle toward the abandoned bride, stopped close enough that only she could see the cold intelligence behind his eyes, and said the one sentence that made the entire church stop breathing. What no one in those pews understood yet was that the debt he'd come to collect wasn't money. The Whitmore family had been hiding something for 30 years, and the woman left crying at the altar was about to discover that being claimed by the most dangerous man in the city might be the only thing that could save her. Because behind all that ice, Roman Vance was more alone than anyone she'd ever met, and Adeline Whitmore was about to become the one person on earth who could reach him. If this opening already has you hooked, do me a quick favor and tap that like button so more people can find this story. Share it with someone who loves a dark, slow-burn romance with a twist they'll never see coming. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single chapter of what happens next. Now let's go back to that silent church and find out exactly what Roman Vance whispered to the bride everyone else had left behind. The sentence was not loud, not threatening, only a quiet statement meant for Adeline alone to hear. Yet it carried a weight that seemed to drain the very air from the room. Your groom has run away, but the debt doesn't know how to run, and I've come to marry what he didn't dare take on. Adeline stood frozen, the white bouquet in her hands clenched so tightly that the stems and leaves began to snap, while behind her, the whispers of 300 guests died at once, as though someone had pulled the plug on the entire room. She lifted her head, forcing herself to look straight into those cold gray eyes, instead of lowering her gaze, the way the powerful men seated in the pews might have expected. And her voice, though dry, rang out clearly. I don't understand what you're talking about. My family owes Sterling Trust Bank, not a stranger who just kicked open a church door. Roman Vance tilted his head slightly, a gesture almost curious, as though he was not used to being questioned. Sterling Trust belongs to the Vance Empire, Miss Whitmore. It has controlled your family for 30 years, and its authority now rests entirely with me. You borrowed money from a name on paper, but the person who approved that loan, the person who decides whether your family lives or dies every time a deadline comes due, has always been me. That was the first piece of leverage, the debt of honor, the thing that had bound the Whitmore bloodline to the Vance name from before she was even born, and Adeline felt as though the marble floor beneath her feet had tilted. But she did not fall. She was far too used to standing steady in rooms where bad news came down like hail, used to keeping her face calm while telling a family that someone they loved would not survive the night. Then send me the bill, she said, lifting her chin. I'll pay it. Every cent. You don't need a wedding to collect a loan. Something passed across Roman's face. Not a smile, but recognition. Like a hunter, realizing his prey had no intention of running. He slipped a hand inside his suit jacket, and the 4 men standing along the aisle tensed faintly. But what he pulled out was not a weapon. It was a slim phone. He turned the screen toward her, close enough that only she could see. Before you promise to pay every cent, perhaps you should know how your father paid the previous ones. On the screen were numbers, wire transfers, company names Adeline had never heard before, and in the middle of it all was the signature of her father, Arthur Whitmore, repeated again and again across documents that even with her untrained eyes she understood were the kind of thing that could send a man to prison for the rest of his life. That was the second piece of leverage, and it was entirely different from the first. The debt of honor was the reason Roman had come here, the lawful excuse inside his world. But the bundle of evidence showing the money her father had laundered through shell companies to keep the family from collapsing, that was what made it impossible for her to turn and walk out of this church. "Your father signed these things to save all of you," Roman said, his voice still as even as though he were reciting a grocery list. "If these documents fall into the right hands, he won't die in the ancestral house you're trying so hard to save. He'll die in a federal cell. And the Whitmore name you work double shifts to protect will become a joke in every paper from here to New York." Adeline felt her throat tighten, but she did not allow a single tear to fall, not in front of 300 people, holding their breath and waiting to see her collapse. She thought of her father sitting in the front pew, his trembling hand pressed to his temple, and she understood that this man did not need to threaten to kill anyone. He only needed to show her that he held the fate of the only person left in the world she loved. "So this is what you want," she said, and her voice was so cold it surprised even her. "My signature in exchange for your silence." Roman put the phone away, his gray eyes never leaving her. "I want more than a signature, Miss Whitmore. But tonight, the signature will be enough." Adeline looked around the church one last time, at the powerful faces waiting for her family's humiliation as though waiting for a performance, then looked back at the man standing before her, the man who had turned her broken wedding into a negotiation. "If I sign," she said, and this time she was the one who stepped half a pace closer to him, "then I have conditions of my own." Her condition hung in the air, but to understand why she had the courage to set conditions before a man like Roman Vance, one had to go back only 20 minutes earlier, when Adeline was still a bride who believed the worst thing that could happen to her was being abandoned. In the bridal room behind the sanctuary, amid heavy velvet curtains and the suffocating smell of makeup and powder, Meredith Ashford, her only close friend and also her bridesmaid, had rushed in with a bloodless face and a trembling note in her hand. "Preston is gone," Meredith whispered, unable to look her friend directly in the eyes. His groomsmen found this in the dressing room. His private plane was cleared for takeoff at Logan before they even finished fixing your veil. Adeline took the note, Preston Callahan's hurried handwriting blurring before her eyes, and those lines were not an apology, but a rejection. "I can't pay that price, Adeline. They have come to collect, and I don't want to become collateral for a debt that isn't mine. The Vance debt is yours now. Forgive me." She read it 3 times, trying to understand, because in her mind, this marriage had always been a fair arrangement. The Callahan Corporation would absorb her family's debt in exchange for the noble blood and old name of the Whitmores, a merger disguised as romance that she had gritted her teeth and accepted. But the name Vance on that piece of paper made a chill run down her spine, because it was not a name in any contract she had ever seen. "Who is Vance?" she asked, turning toward her father, Arthur Whitmore, who had been sitting silently all this time in the velvet-upholstered chair in the corner of the room, and in the very moment he lifted his head, Adeline truly felt afraid for the first time that day, because the face of the father who had always tried to appear calm had collapsed into something she had never seen in all her 26 years as his daughter. The pure terror of a man who had just heard the name of something he had spent his whole life praying he would never have to hear again. "It wasn't Sterling Trust," he stammered, both hands covering his face. "Sterling Trust was never a real bank, my child. It was only a shell, a name on paper. For the past 30 years, the Vance family has always been behind it." Adeline knelt in front of her father and took his trembling hands. "What are you talking about, father? We borrowed from a bank to save the shipping company. I saw the documents. I signed some of them." Arthur shook his head, tears running down his wrinkled face. "You only saw the surface. The real loan began in the 90s, when your grandfather stood on the edge of bankruptcy, and no decent bank would lend our family another cent. He turned to another kind of power, one that did not operate by ordinary interest rates and documents, but by an oath of honor between 2 families, that if the Whitmores could never repay in money, then the debt would be settled in their way." A sudden numbness washed over Adeline. What is their way? Her father did not answer that question. He only tightened his grip on her hands, as though afraid that if he let go, he would lose her forever. "I tried," he choked out. "I tried to marry you into the Callahan family, so you could hide under the protection of a family large enough that the Vance name could not touch you. That is why I pushed this marriage, not because of Preston's money, but because of the shield that came with it. But that boy found out how large the debt was, and he ran. And when the groom runs, when the marriage collapses, then by the terms of the oath, the debt automatically falls onto the eldest daughter of the Whitmore bloodline." He looked up at his daughter, his eyes shattered. It falls onto you, Adeline. And that was the moment, just before the doors of the sanctuary burst open, when Adeline understood that her father had sold her off to escape a debt. She knew the man who was arriving did not come to collect money, but to claim her. No matter how frightened she was, she would not allow herself to run like the coward who had left only a note on the table. Back in the present, beneath the trembling candlelight of St. Augustine's sanctuary, Adeline stood half a step from Roman Vance and stated her condition in a voice that did not waver. If I sign, then my family's debt is wiped clean. All of it, not part of it. My father is safe. The documents on your phone disappear forever. And no one in this room is touched. Not today, not ever. That is the price of my signature. Roman looked at her for a long while, long enough that the whole church seemed to believe he would refuse. Then he gave a slight nod, a single nod as decisive as a seal pressed into wax. You have my word, Miss Whitmore. And in my world, a man's word binds tighter than any contract you have ever signed. He turned toward the old priest, standing frozen beside the pulpit, Father Emmett, who was still clutching the Bible to his chest as though it could protect him from what was happening. Father, the marriage license is still on the altar, isn't it? The priest stammered that it had been issued for a Mr. Callahan, and Roman answered with only one short sentence, his voice gentle but allowing no resistance. Cross that name out. Write mine in. For one moment, Father Emmett looked toward Adeline, his eyes questioning, almost pleading, waiting for her to say no, waiting for some sign that would give him a reason to stop. But Adeline only gave a faint nod, and in that nod was an ocean of pain she refused to let anyone see. The ceremony unfolded with cruel speed. No music rose, no camera clicked in celebration, no happy tears fell from relatives. There was only Father Emmett's trembling voice echoing through the cold stone space. Vows once written for love, now twisted into the terms of a bargain. When the priest asked whether Adeline agreed to take this man, she looked straight into Roman's gray eyes and answered, I do, in a clear voice. Not the voice of a bride, but of someone sealing her own fate with her own hand to save the person she loved. When Roman's turn came, he did not hesitate. I do, he said, and slid onto her trembling finger a heavy diamond ring, the stone cut in an antique style, cold as ice when it touched her skin. Then Father Emmett, in a voice that nearly broke, made the sign of the cross and pronounced them husband and wife. Without a second thought, he slipped one arm around her back, drew her close in a gesture both gentle and utterly possessive, and when his mouth touched hers, it was not a kiss of love, but a mark of territory, a silent declaration to the 300 people watching that this woman now belonged to him, and anyone who dared think otherwise would pay the price. The kiss was brief, but long enough for Adeline to feel the cold power radiating from him, and when he drew back, she caught, in that fleeting instant, something in his eyes that was not entirely triumph, something almost like loneliness, but it vanished so quickly that she wondered whether she had imagined it. Roman turned to face the crowd, one hand still keeping her close beside him, and his voice carried through the sanctuary, calm and commanding. The wedding reception is cancelled. My wife and I have business elsewhere. No one dared object. The powerful guests, the senators, the financial magnates accustomed to giving orders to the entire world, now sat silent in their pews, lowering their heads to avoid the gaze of the man who had just married another man's bride at the altar. Adeline glanced toward her father and saw him collapsed in the front pew, his shoulders shaking with mingled relief and shame. And she understood that though she had just lost her freedom, she had also bought back his life and his honor. As Roman led her down the aisle between two rows of absolute silence, hesitant camera flashes flared and then quickly died, and Adeline held her head high, walking like a queen rather than a prisoner, because she had already decided that if she had to fall, she would fall facing forward. Outside the sanctuary, Boston's cold sea wind lashed at Adeline's veil as Roman led her toward a convoy of 6 glossy black SUVs, waiting along the cobblestone street, surrounded by men in dark suits standing motionless as statues. One of them, tall and lean with graying hair and calm eyes, opened the door of the lead car and gave a slight bow as Roman guided her inside. The door closed with a heavy thud, like the door of a vault, cutting her off from the panicked noise of the world outside. And for the first time since she had stepped out of the bridal room, Adeline allowed herself to release a trembling breath. She pulled the heavy veil from her hair and threw it onto the seat across from her, as though trying to cast off that entire horrifying morning along with it. You're shaking, Roman observed, sitting comfortably beside her, entirely at ease in the confined space of the car. "Are you mourning Preston Callahan? Or are you afraid of the man sitting next to you?" Adeline turned to look at him, her eyes dry and sharp. "I'm mourning my right to choose for myself, not him. Preston was a business arrangement, a coward who ran when the books stopped balancing. I won't shed a single tear for him." A quiet laugh, low and vibrating, slipped from Roman's throat. "A practical bride. Good. But you've misunderstood the situation, Miss Whitmore. Preston didn't simply run from the Vance debt. He accelerated it." Adeline frowned, and Roman pulled a slim tablet from inside his suit jacket, touched the screen, and handed it to her. On it were offshore bank accounts, encrypted transfer orders, and a long file on financial collapse. "For the past 18 months, Roman said, his gray eyes narrowing, "Preston has been quietly siphoning money from Sterling Trust, my shell company, to cover failed investments by the Callahan Pharmaceutical Group in Europe. He thought he could steal from a shadow without anyone noticing." Adeline felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach as she understood the true meaning of those numbers. When he realized who he was stealing from, Roman continued, his voice even. He panicked, and instead of running right away, he came up with a trick. He would marry you, use the Whitmore bloodline and your family's old oath as a shield, hoping that once he became part of such an ancient contract of honor, he would be granted immunity in my world. Adeline felt her throat tighten, because she had just recognized the bitter truth. Preston had not only abandoned her at the altar, he had deliberately turned her into a living shield between himself and an executioner. "Where is he now?" she whispered, her eyes still fixed on the evidence on the screen. "His jet was cleared for takeoff at Logan," Roman answered, with a chilling nonchalance that suggested it was merely an ordinary administrative task, but it never left American airspace. "My people arranged for it to be forced down at a private airport in Pennsylvania before it could get far. Preston Callahan is currently being well cared for, in a place where he will have plenty of time to rebalance the books he made such a mess of. I despise thieves." Adeline leaned back against the leather seat, the weight of all the power this man held pressing down on her like a stone. Then Roman added another sentence, almost casually, but it made her lift her head. "The interesting thing is, Preston wasn't smart enough to think of stealing from an organization like mine on his own. Someone showed him the door. Someone introduced him into those deals. An old name, someone I once trusted." His gray eyes darkened for an instant, and for the first time Adeline saw a fine crack in his cold layer of ice, something very close to a betrayal that had not yet healed. "But that is a matter I'll handle myself," he said, putting the tablet away. Adeline did not ask anything more, but that unspoken name hung suspended in the air between them, like the seed of something darker than everything she had just endured. The convoy did not stop at a hotel or a suburban mansion as Adeline had imagined, but drove straight into the heart of the seaport, where a tower of black glass rose into the Boston evening sky like an upright blade, with no logo, no sign, only a polished mass of darkness reflecting the sunset. The gray-haired man who had opened the car door earlier, whom she heard Roman call Grigor, led them through a private lobby and into an elevator that stopped only at the top floor, and when the elevator doors opened, Adeline stepped into a space so vast that the sound of her footsteps echoed. The penthouse was a blend of cold luxury and almost punishing minimalism, with glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling and embracing the entire city view, expensive furniture arranged with perfect precision, yet giving off not the slightest trace of warmth. The first thing Adeline noticed, with eyes accustomed to observing the details others missed, was that there was not a single photograph in the home. No family pictures, no friends, not one human moment preserved on those empty walls, as though the person who lived here had carefully erased every proof that he had ever belonged to anyone. When a housekeeper silently set dinner in the dining room, Adeline noticed that the long table, large enough to seat 20 people, had been set with only one place, and she understood that before she came, the most powerful man in the city had still sat down to eat alone every night, in that immense silence. She was taken to a separate bedroom, and given a silk robe and every possible comfort, but she could not sleep, and when she stepped into the hallway late that night, she found Roman standing alone by the window, one hand braced against the glass frame, his face in the darkness marked by lines of pain that he hid during the day. He was massaging his shoulder and right arm with slow movements, and even from that distance, Adeline's professional instinct spoke before her reason did. "You're in pain," she said, and Roman turned sharply, his gray eyes flashing with the wariness of a man unaccustomed to being caught in weakness. "It's nothing," he answered curtly, but Adeline had already stepped closer, and under the dim light, she saw old scars running along his forearm where his shirt sleeve had been rolled up, pale white lines long healed, but telling a story she had no right yet to hear. "Your shoulder muscle is locked, and the way you're holding your arm tells me there's an old injury that never healed properly," she said, her voice shifting into the calm, professional tone she used at a patient's bedside. "Sit down. I'm a nurse. Let me look." Roman stared at her for a long while, and in his eyes was a strange struggle, as though her simple offer were a language he no longer remembered how to answer. Then, slowly, he sat down in the nearby armchair. Adeline stood behind him, placed both hands on his tense shoulders, and began pressing into the knots with the precise force of someone who had done this thousands of times. She felt his whole body stiffen beneath her hands, not from pain, but from something she could not name, and she understood, with a feeling both aching and bewildering, that this might be the first time in a very long while anyone had touched this man not out of fear, not to plead, not for some calculated benefit, but simply because they wanted to ease his pain. Little by little, the muscles beneath her hands began to loosen, and Roman's breathing slowed, deepening. Neither of them said a word, but in that silence, something had quietly shifted. A tiny crack in the wall of ice Roman Vance had spent his whole life building. When Adeline finally withdrew her hands, he did not turn around, only said softly, his voice strangely hoarse, "Thank you." And she realized those were probably 2 words he very rarely had to use. 3 days later, while Adeline was still trying to find the rhythm of her new life inside the glass tower, a phone call at dawn pulled Roman from bed with a hardened expression she had never seen before. A Vance Group shipment, a consignment of legally imported medical equipment belonging to the business division Roman was trying to cleanse so he could bring his empire into the light, had been sabotaged inside a warehouse at Boston Harbor, and 2 of his men had been injured in the confusion. Roman intended to leave her at the penthouse, but when he looked at her for a moment and then toward the door, Adeline realized he did not want her out of his sight, not because he did not trust her, but because in his world, a wife left alone was a weakness enemies could exploit. And so she sat inside the armored SUV, crossing the still, sleepy city toward the harbor, where giant cranes stood in black silhouette against the gray sky. Inside the cold warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of machine oil and seawater. Overturned crates lay scattered everywhere, and Adeline saw with her own eyes for the first time how her husband's world operated. Silent men moving with military precision, Grigor giving orders in a low voice, and Roman standing at the center of it all like a still point around which everything else turned. But what struck her most strongly was not that power, but a young man leaning against a crate in the far corner, his features drawn and ghostly, one hand pressed tightly to the wound in his side, left unattended, while everyone focused on assessing the damage. Without a second of hesitation, Adeline's professional instinct overrode every fear. She rushed over and dropped to her knees beside him, pushing his trembling hand aside to examine the wound. "Bring me clean cloth, anything you have, and a first aid kit if there is one here," she ordered, her voice so firm and clear that the 2 men standing nearby immediately obeyed even though no one had told them to. She pressed hard against the wound to stop the bleeding, checked his breathing and the color of his face, spoke to him in a soothing voice to keep him conscious, asked his name, asked if he could hear her, turning one corner of the chaotic warehouse into a space where she was the one in control. The young man, whose name was Nicola, clung to her voice as though it were a lifeline, and beneath her steady hands, the panic in his eyes began to ease. When Roman's private medical team finally arrived, they found the first aid had been done with clean, professional precision, and the person in charge gave her a slight nod, a silent recognition between people of the same calling. From the other side of the warehouse, Roman had stood still and watched everything, and something in his eyes shifted as he looked at the wife he had married as a debt kneeling on the cold concrete floor, her hands stained with the blood of a man she did not even know, simply because she could not look away from another human being in pain. It was not the stubborn courage he had seen in the church, but something far rarer in his world, a conscience that did not calculate. But when Grigor stepped over and handed Roman an object found among the broken cargo, his expression hardened again. It was a small chess piece made of ebony, a pawn, placed deliberately and neatly on the lid of an overturned crate, not something dropped by accident but left behind as a message. Roman picked up the piece and turned it between his fingers, and Adeline saw his jaw tighten. saw the old crack of betrayal she had glimpsed in the car now plainly marked on his face. "This was not a robbery," he said softly, almost to himself. "This was a test. He wants to see how I respond." Adeline did not fully understand the meaning of that chess piece, but she understood that it was tied to the old name Roman had refused to say in the car, and that someone out there was playing a game neither she nor Roman had yet seen in full. That chess piece haunted Roman through the following week, and Adeline noticed that he grew more watchful, his meetings stretching late into the night, the number of guards around the tower doubling, as though he were waiting for a strike he knew with certainty would come, but could not tell from which direction. And it came on a moonless night, when Adeline had only just slipped into a restless sleep, and the entire building suddenly plunged into absolute darkness. The lights went out all at once, not like an ordinary power failure, but like a deliberate, decisive cut. And immediately afterward the backup alarm shrieked, and then went dead as well, as though someone knew exactly what needed to be disabled, and exactly when to do it. Adeline sat up in the darkness, her heart pounding, and only a few seconds later her bedroom door flew open. A beam of flashlight swept across the room, and then Roman's firm hand had closed around hers. "Come with me and don't make a sound," he said, his voice low and calm to a chilling degree, the calm of a man who had survived countless nights like this. He pulled her into the hallway, where Grigor and several of his men were already moving in formation. And from the floors below, Adeline heard the sounds of an intrusion rising upward, breaking glass, heavy footsteps, orders barked in an Eastern European language she did not understand. "Sokolov," Grigor said softly, and Roman tightened his jaw. "Yuri Sokolov, an old warlord from New York," he explained briefly to Adeline as they moved along the dark wall. "He has wanted my territory for years, but he never had the courage to attack on his own unless someone opened the way for him from inside." The sentence sent a chill down Adeline's spine, because its meaning was too clear. No one could cut power to the entire security system of a fortress like this. No one could know the exact moment to strike, unless that person stood within Roman's own ranks. They reached an emergency stairwell, but the moment Roman pushed the door open, two of Sokolov's men were already waiting there, and a fast, decisive struggle broke out in the darkness. Grigor and his men subdued them with precise, efficient blows, nothing wasted, nothing theatrical, while Roman pushed Adeline into the safety of a wall recess, using his own body to shield her from sight. In that brief instant, with his back pressed close in front of her and his breathing impossibly steady amid the chaos, Adeline realized something strange. She did not feel safer beside this danger, yet she felt protected in a way Preston, the man who had left her among wolves, had never made her feel. The noise died down a little, and Roman led her onward through a side corridor she guessed very few people knew about, to a reinforced room with thick walls, a refuge designed for exactly this kind of night. But the moment the heavy door closed behind them, Adeline realized that one of Roman's men was already inside. A young man with a tense face, one hand clutching his shoulder as though he had been wounded while escaping, breathing hard and saying he had gotten out from the lower floor to protect the boss. Roman nodded, accepting his presence without suspicion, because this was a man he had promoted himself, a man he had trusted with his entire security system. But Adeline, standing silently in the corner of the room, her eyes accustomed to reading the human body in its weakest moments, began to feel that something was wrong. A tiny misalignment she could not yet name between the panic on that man's face and something else, colder, hidden behind his eyes. The man's name was Damon Reyes, the head of security whom Roman had personally raised from a common foot soldier to the position of holding the keys to the entire fortress, and that was precisely why no one in the room thought to suspect him. No one except Adeline. She stood silently in the corner, and while Roman and Grigor discussed a counterattack in short, clipped sentences, her eyes, trained through thousands of shifts, remained fixed on Damon because something about him did not fit, a small misalignment so slight that only someone accustomed to reading the human body in pain would notice. Damon was clutching his right shoulder and breathing hard, claiming he had been wounded while escaping from the lower floors, but his body was telling a story entirely different from his mouth. A man who had just escaped a life-or-death fight and climbed several flights of stairs in panic would breathe quickly but shallowly and unevenly, sweat breaking out from exertion and fear, his pupils widened by the surge of adrenaline. But Damon, though he was trying to perform breathlessness, had breathing that was too steady in the lower part of his lungs. His skin was strangely dry, and the hand supposedly pressing against his wound had no blood on it at all. nor did it tremble from pain the way a truly wounded person's hand would. The longer Adeline watched, the more certain she became. This man was not injured. He was acting, and he was acting so he would have a legitimate reason to be inside this refuge room, as close as possible to Roman Vance, on the very night when every layer of defense had been disabled by a hand from within. And then she saw the thing that made her blood turn cold. Damon's other hand, the one not holding his shoulder, was slowly sliding behind his back, toward his waistband, a slow, discreet movement disguised beneath the posture of a man in pain, trying to find something to lean on. Adeline had no time to weigh anything, no time to doubt herself. She had only one moment, and she used it. "Roman," she shouted, her voice tearing through the silence. "He isn't wounded. Don't trust him." For a split second, everything froze. Damon's eyes snapped toward her with a deadly coldness that had shed the mask of panic completely, and the thing he was pulling from behind his back showed beneath the dim beam of the flashlight. But Adeline's warning had bought Roman exactly the moment he needed. With the speed of a man who had survived countless betrayals, Roman lunged forward, seizing Damon's arm before he could complete the movement, and in the few brief seconds when Adeline almost did not dare to breathe, Grigor and another man had overpowered the traitor, pinning him to the floor. Damon no longer pretended. His face twisted with fury, and with the look of a man who had just watched months of calculation collapse because of a single sentence from the woman no one should have noticed. "She was supposed to be just a debt," he hissed, looking at Roman with eyes full of bitterness. "No one told me you'd married a woman who knew how to look." Roman straightened, his face a storm held under control, and he looked down at the man he had once trusted with a cold pain more terrifying than any rage. "How long, Damon?" he asked softly. "How long have you been selling me to Sokolov?" But Damon only laughed, a broken laugh, and said one sentence that sent a chill down Adeline's spine. "You still think this is about Sokolov? You really are blinder than I thought." Roman stood motionless for a moment, and in his gray eyes, Adeline saw that old crack of betrayal appear again, deeper than ever, along with a question she knew would haunt him, because if this was not about Sokolov, then whose hand was truly pulling the strings behind all of this? But the night was not over, and the footsteps of Sokolov's men were drawing closer beyond the reinforced door. The reinforced door shook beneath a barrage of blows from outside, and Roman understood that this refuge was no longer safe once the man inside had shown the way to the men beyond the door. He handed Damon, who had been restrained, over to two of his men, ordered Grigor to lead the group out through the backup exit, then pulled Adeline close behind him, just as the door finally burst open, and Sokolov's men flooded in. At their head was Yuri Sokolov himself, a tall man with silver hair and the smile of someone certain he had already won, stepping into the room as though it already belonged to him. "Roman Vance," he said, his voice thick and full of contempt. "You let a debtor and a traitor decide the fate of an entire empire. How disappointing. I've come to take your territory, and I'll take your bride with me as a souvenir." What happened next unfolded so quickly that Adeline could barely grasp it. Sokolov's men rushed forward, and the room became a chaos of bodies colliding in the flickering beams of flashlights, while Grigor and Roman's remaining men fought back with cold discipline, subduing each attacker with decisive, efficient, unshowy blows. Roman moved through that chaos like a force of nature, not confused for a moment, every motion calculated, and in several breathless minutes, the balance began to tilt in his favor, because Sokolov's men had come with the confidence of people who believed they would win easily through surprise. But that surprise had been taken from them the moment Adeline exposed Damon. Sokolov, realizing the game was slipping from his hands, did what desperate men always do. He no longer aimed at Roman, but straight at the only weakness he could see, the woman standing behind him. He lunged toward Adeline with all the recklessness of a man who had lost everything, and in that moment, time seemed to slow for her. She saw Sokolov coming, saw the flash of metal in his hand, and knew she would not be able to move in time. But Roman was already there. He turned with a speed his body, carrying its old injuries, should not have possessed. And instead of moving aside to protect himself, he did the opposite. He threw himself between Adeline and Sokolov, using his own body as a living shield for her. There was a heavy impact, a sharp breath forced back into his chest, and Adeline felt the full weight of Roman fall toward her as he stopped the blow meant for her with his own shoulder and ribs. Then Grigor was there, seizing Sokolov from behind with two others, forcing the warlord down onto the floor and stripping the weapon from him, ending the fight only seconds later. But Adeline no longer cared about Sokolov, because Roman was swaying, one hand pressed tightly against his side, and when he pulled it away, she saw dark red spreading across the white fabric of his shirt. "Roman," she cried, and her professional instinct rose at once. She caught him, helped him sit, her hands already beginning to examine the wound with urgent precision. But what made her freeze was not the wound, but the meaning of it. This man, the one who had lived his whole life believing love was weakness, that only fools placed themselves in danger for someone else, had just done exactly the thing he had always despised. He had chosen to take the attack meant for her, a wife he had married as a debt, a woman who by every logic of his world should have been nothing more than a chess piece that could be sacrificed. "Why did you do that?" Adeline whispered, her hand still pressing firmly over his wound, her eyes lifting to look straight into the gray eyes now softened by pain. Roman looked at her for a long while, his breathing heavy, and in that gaze there was no longer the cold ice of the man who had kicked open the church door, but a confusion almost childlike, as though he himself could not understand his own action. "I don't know," he said softly, and it was the most honest answer he had ever given anyone. Roman's wound was not life-threatening, but it was deep enough that his private medical team had to stitch it closed and order him to rest for several days, a command a man like him would never normally obey, until Adeline made it clear in a nurse's voice that allowed no argument that if he tore the stitches, he would be bedridden even longer, and that would only make his enemies happy. So in the days that followed, she became the one who cared for him, changing his bandages every morning, checking for signs of infection, forcing him to take his medicine and eat properly, and little by little, inside the quiet space of that once cold penthouse, something began to thaw between them. Roman, unaccustomed to the presence of another person during moments of weakness, at first resisted her care with curt sentences and wary looks. But Adeline's calm patience, the way she neither feared him nor worshipped him, and simply treated him as a human being who needed healing, wore down his defenses bit by bit. Then late one night, as she was replacing his bandage and the desk lamp cast its light over the old scars on his forearm that she had noticed before, Roman spoke, his voice low and distant, as though it were echoing from some very deep place. "You keep looking at these scars," he said, not as a question. Adeline paused, and instead of looking away, she met his eyes directly. "They're very old. From when you were very young." Roman was silent for a long while, and she thought he would say nothing more, but then he began to tell her, slowly, like a man opening a door that had been sealed for decades. He told her that he had not been born with the name Vance, that he had grown up without parents, only one of countless nameless children passed from place to place, where no one truly wanted to keep him, a childhood so harsh that he learned very early that no one in this world came to save you, that kindness always came with a price, and that weakness was always seen and used by others. He told her about a man who found him when he was still a hard-headed, starving teenager, a powerful boss who took him in, trained him, turned him from a child with no future into the heir of an entire hidden empire, and for many years, Roman had loved that man like the father he had never had trusted him with all the loyalty of a child, desperate to belong to someone. "And then he sold me," Roman said, his voice not trembling at all, but that very calmness was more painful than any sob. "When it benefited him, when a larger bargain was placed on the table, the man I called father handed me over like a chess piece, without hesitation, without regret. I learned the final and most important lesson of my life that day, that love, trust, attachment, all of them are only beautiful names people give to weakness, and weakness is always exploited. I rebuilt everything from those ashes, and I swore I would never give anyone the power to betray me again." Adeline listened in silence, and when he finished, she did not offer hollow, comforting words, did not show pity, because she understood that pity was the last thing this man would want to receive. Instead, she only placed her hand over his, a simple, warm gesture, and said softly, "The person who did that to you was the coward, not you, and the fact that you were still able to throw yourself in front of a blow meant for someone else, after everything you have been through, proves that he was wrong. He didn't kill the human part of you. He only made you bury it very deep." Roman turned to look at her, and in those gray eyes was something he had never allowed anyone to see, a fragile, frightened spark of hope that perhaps, only perhaps, she was right. But the fragile closeness that had begun to grow between them was exactly what frightened Roman. because in the worldview he had spent his whole life building, the closer he allowed someone to come, the more power he gave that person to destroy him. And a few days after the night he opened his heart, when his wound had begun to heal, and his old defensive wall started rising again, Roman suddenly became coldly distant. He avoided her, handed his care back to the medical team, and one evening, when Adeline tried to ask him about the arrangements for her future, about whether she would be allowed to contact her father, he answered in the voice of the man from the church, the voice that turned her into a clause in a contract. "You are being cared for, you are being protected, and you will remain here until I decide otherwise," he said, not even lifting his eyes from the file in front of him. "That is what our agreement guarantees. You don't need to ask anything more." And something inside Adeline, something that had been pressed down for days, finally burst open. "Our agreement," she repeated, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from anger that had been held in for too long. "You say it as if I'm a shipment you purchased, a line in your books. I changed your bandages every morning. I stayed awake through the night watching for signs of infection. I screamed a warning when Damon pointed a weapon at you, and I caught you when you were bleeding because of me. I listened when you told me about the abandoned child you once were, and I didn't turn away, and you still stand there and call me an agreement." Roman looked up, his face hardening, but Adeline had already stepped closer, tears finally rolling down her cheeks, not the tears of weakness but of a person pushed to the very edge. "I am not a debt, Roman," she said, her voice breaking, but every word clear. "I am not a trophy you took from a coward at the church. I am not a chess piece on the board shared by you and Sokolov, and all those powerful men who only know how to look at one another as threats to be removed. I am a human being. I had a name before it was crossed out and replaced with yours on that paper. I had dreams that I buried to save my father. I have a heart, and you cannot demand that it care for you while treating it like property." The room fell silent, a silence so heavy that Adeline could hear her own heartbeat. And Roman stood there, the man whom no one had ever dared speak to so directly, the man before whom the entire city bowed its head, motionless as if her words were knives he did not know how to defend himself against. "All my life," she continued, her voice softer now but still trembling, "I've been treated as something to be exchanged. My father married me off to pay a debt. Preston married me to use me as a shield, and then threw me away. You claimed me to balance a ledger that has existed for a century. Not one of you ever asked what I wanted. Not one of you ever looked at me and saw a human being instead of a tool. And I thought you, after everything, after the night you took that blow for me, might be different." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and when she spoke the final sentence, her voice had become steady again, the steadiness of someone who had reclaimed her dignity. "If you can only see me as property, then you are no better than the men who did that to you when you were a child. You become the very thing that destroyed you." The sentence hit its mark in a way no bullet ever could, and Adeline saw it appear on Roman's face, a silent shock, a realization that made his whole body sink slightly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, for the first time in his life unable to find any words to answer. And Adeline, having said everything that needed to her room, leaving the most powerful man in Boston standing alone in the vast space with a truth he could no longer avoid. That night, Adeline could not sleep, not because her anger was still smoldering, but because one question kept returning again and again in her mind, a question she realized she had never truly tried to answer. Why had her grandfather, a proud man of the Whitmore line, chosen to bind the entire family to an oath of honor with the underworld, instead of simply letting the shipping company go bankrupt the way so many old empires had done before? She remembered the terror in her father's eyes when he heard the name Vance, a fear far deeper than the fear of losing money or losing a house, and she began to suspect that the story of the debt her father had told her in the bridal room was only the surface of something much darker. The next morning, making use of the right to communicate that she had finally won for herself, Adeline called her father and forced him to tell her the whole truth, and Arthur's voice over the phone, weary and resigned like a man who had carried this burden for far too long, finally broke open. "I had hoped you would never have to know," he said, "but you are already in their house now, so you have the right to know where you are standing." And he told her the real story, the story 3 generations of Whitmores had buried together. In the years when her grandfather stood on the brink, the problem had not only been money, but a scandal, a deadly mistake her grandfather had made in desperation, an act that crossed the line of the law far enough not only to destroy the company, but to send him to prison and permanently stain the Whitmore name, leaving every generation after him, including Adeline, to live under the shadow of that disgrace. And the person who saved your grandfather, Arthur said, his voice trembling, did not do it by lending money, but by making that scandal disappear, by making the evidence that could have buried our entire bloodline vanish into smoke. It was the head of the Vance family at the time, Roman's adoptive father. Adeline gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding as the pieces began fitting together in a way she had never anticipated. Then this debt, she whispered, is not just a loan. No, my child, her father answered. It is a debt of both honor and life. The Vance family did not merely give your grandfather money to survive. They gave our family everything we had afterward. An intact name, freedom, a future. Your grandfather swore that the Whitmore line would repay that debt when called upon, and he swore it by the only thing a man who had lost everything had left, the honor of the generations after him. I tried to break that oath by marrying you into the Callahan family, and I was terribly wrong to do it, because in the world of those people, breaking an oath of honor is worse than failing to repay a debt. When the call ended, Adeline sat motionless for a long time by the window, looking out at the city waking below, and a strange feeling rose in her heart, not the outrage she had expected, but a painful understanding. She realized that she and Roman, two people forced together by a coerced marriage, were in fact victims of the same past, both carrying the consequences of decisions made by men who had been dead for a long time. On one side, her grandfather with his hidden sin, on the other Roman's adoptive father with his kindness that came with its price. Both of them were bound to an oath they had never chosen. Both had their fates decided before they were even born, and for the first time, when Adeline thought of Roman, she no longer saw only the powerful captor who had forced her hand, but an unwilling companion inside the same prison built from the guilt and honor of the generation before them, and she understood that if there was anyone in this world who could truly understand the weight she was carrying, it was the lonely man standing on the other side of that cold wall. While Adeline was slowly coming to understand the invisible thread that bound her fate to Roman's, down on the lower floors of the tower, Roman himself was following another thread, the one that led to the true hand pulling every string. Damon Reyes, after many days of confinement and questioning, had finally revealed what he knew, and the sentence he had thrown out on the night of the attempted coup, that this was not about Sokolov, turned out not to be the lie of a desperate man, but the final piece Roman needed. When Grigor placed a thin file and an ebony pawn identical to the chess piece found in the harbor warehouse on the table, Roman's face, which so rarely revealed emotion, hardened into a rigid mask, and Adeline, who had just stepped into the room, read there an emotion she had never seen in him before. Not anger, but something close to the terror of a man who had just seen a ghost. "Impossible," Roman said softly, picking up the chess piece. "He's dead. I buried him with my own hands." "Who is dead?" Adeline asked, stepping closer. Roman set the chess piece down, and when he turned to look at her, the familiar ice on his face had cracked open, revealing an old wound she had never known was there. "Julian Marsh," he said, the name leaving his mouth like a curse. "The man who used to be my right hand, the only friend I ever allowed myself to trust after my adoptive father betrayed me. 7 years ago, there was an internal purge, and I was told Julian had died in it, that he had betrayed me and paid the price. I mourned him, even while believing he had sold me out, but he never died. He only disappeared, waited, and rebuilt." The pieces now struck Adeline with chilling clarity, and she saw that Roman himself was fitting them together in real time. The old name he had refused to say in the car, the person who had introduced Preston into those deals so he would have the chance to embezzle money from Vance, was Julian. The chess piece left at the harbor warehouse, a carefully staged message rather than a robbery, was Julian's test to measure Roman's reaction, to see how sharp he remained after all these years. Yuri Sokolov, the warlord who had seemed to launch the coup on his own, was in truth only a piece Julian had pushed into position, supplied with information and timing. And Damon Reyes, the mole planted in the heart of the fortress, was the knife Julian had patiently sharpened for years. "He doesn't only want to kill you," Adeline said, her voice trembling as the full picture emerged. "If he only wanted to kill you, he would have done it already. He wants more than that." Roman nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. Julian has always been a chess player. He was never satisfied with merely toppling a king. He wanted the whole board. He built all of this, pushed Preston onto the path of theft to pull your family into the game, awakened the old debt to force me to come to the church that day, then stirred up Sokolov and planted Damon, all so that I and the Whitmore family, two powers bound together, would destroy each other with our own hands in a bloody war. And once both of us were exhausted, once my empire and whatever remained of your bloodline were in ruins, he would step out of the darkness and collect everything. Adeline felt a chill, because she realized that her coerced marriage, Preston's betrayal, the terrifying night in the tower, none of it had been accidental. All of it had been calculated moves on the chessboard of a man she had never even met. "Then what do we do?" she asked, and she noticed that she had said we, not you. Roman looked at her, and in his eyes was a silent acknowledgement of the word she had just used. "Julian has had 7 years to prepare this game," he said softly, "but he made one mistake he didn't see coming. He created this marriage to destroy me. He never knew it would become the strongest thing I have." But before Roman could lay out a plan to deal with Julian, another phone call came crashing in, and this time it brought no conspiracy and no chessboard, but the most primal fear in Adeline's heart. Meredith called her voice choked with tears, to say that Arthur Whitmore had just suffered a heart attack and had been rushed to the hospital in critical condition, that his heart had already been weak after years of living under strain, and now the weight of every recent upheaval had pushed it to the edge. Adeline stood frozen, the phone slipping from her hand, and in that moment all the hardness she had built around herself over the past days collapsed, because Arthur, despite all his mistakes and weakness, was still the only person left in the world she loved, the man she had sacrificed her freedom to save. She turned to Roman, and for the first time, she did not try to hide her desperation. "My father," she managed to say, only 2 words, but they were enough. Roman did not ask questions, did not hesitate, did not calculate whether this would benefit him. He only stood, took his coat, and spoke to Grigor in a firm voice of command. And in less than an hour, everything that ordinary money and power could not buy had already been arranged. Arthur was transferred to the finest cardiology unit in the most prestigious hospital in Boston, placed under the care of a heart surgeon whose waiting list usually stretched for months, but who had now set everything else aside, and every cost, every administrative obstacle, every barrier vanished before the Vance name. Adeline sat outside the operating room for hours, and Roman stayed beside her, saying little, only being there, a quiet presence she realized was more precious than any comforting words. When the surgery finally succeeded, and the doctor stepped out to say that Arthur had passed the danger and, with proper care, would fully recover, Adeline collapsed with relief, and without thinking, she fell into Roman's arms, and he, a man who had never known how to comfort anyone, only clumsily wrapped his arms around her and let her cry against his shoulder. That night, when they returned to the tower, Roman did something Adeline had never expected. He placed a folder on the table in front of her, and when she opened it, she realized it contained every document related to her family's debt, along with the evidence of her father's crimes that he had used to force her hand in the church. "I've erased everything," Roman said, his voice low and different. "The debt of honor has been paid, not with you, but with my signature. The documents about your father, I destroyed them all. There are no copies left. There is nothing binding you to me anymore, Adeline. No debt, no threat, no contract." Adeline looked up at him, not understanding, and Roman stepped closer, his gray eyes now free of any trace of ice. "That night, you said I had become the very thing that destroyed me," he said. "You were right. All my life, I have held on to everything through fear, because it was the only language I was taught. But I don't want to keep you that way. I don't want you to stay because you have no other choice, because of your father, because of a piece of paper, because of an oath forced on us by people who are dead. If you stay, I want it to be because you choose to, not because you were forced to choose." He stepped back, creating distance, creating space for a freedom she had never dared dream of. "You are free, Adeline. You can leave tonight if you want to, and no one, not even me, will stop you. I don't keep anyone through fear anymore." The freedom Roman had just given her lay there on the table, concrete and undeniable, a folder of documents that had erased every bond. And in the days that followed, Adeline lived in a strange state, because for the first time, for as long as she could remember, she was completely free to choose her own path. Her father had passed the danger, and was recovering steadily in the hospital. The debt had disappeared, the Whitmore name was safe, and there was no longer any chain keeping her inside this glass tower. She could pack her things, walk out the door, and begin again the life she had lost. She could return to her work as a nurse, even return to the dream of medical school she had buried. Live an ordinary, safe life, far from the world of bullets, schemes, and ebony chess pieces. It was the most reasonable thing to do, the thing anyone in her situation would have done, and Adeline had stood by the window for many nights, looking out over the glittering city, wondering why the thought of leaving made her heart feel heavy instead of relieved. She thought of Roman as she had first seen him, an ice-cold force kicking open a church door, a predator who made even powerful billionaires bow their heads, and then she thought of Roman as she had slowly come to know him, the man who ate dinner alone every night in a room without a single photograph, the abandoned child who had learned to call love weakness so he could survive, the man who had thrown himself in front of a blow meant for her without even understanding why, the man who had sat quietly beside her through her father's surgery without asking anything in return, and finally the man who had torn up every power he held over her with his own hands, just so she could be free to choose. And she realized a truth that stunned even herself, that she did not want to leave. Not because she was afraid, because now there was nothing left to fear. Not because she owed him, because every debt had been erased, but because somewhere in those days of captivity, between the bandages she changed and the long nights when she listened, she had seen the real person hidden behind the ice, and she had fallen in love with that person, not the powerful boss the whole city feared, but the lonely man longing for someone to choose to stay for him alone. That night, Adeline walked into the quiet, starlit living room and found Roman gazing out at the city skyline, no longer hidden behind his mask of ice, and she stepped closer to stand beside him, near enough for him to know she was there. "You gave me the freedom to leave," she said softly, and Roman turned toward her, his face tense like a man waiting for a blow he believed he deserved. "And I have thought about it a great deal." She drew a breath, then looked straight into those gray eyes. "All my life, other people have chosen for me. My father chose to marry me off. Preston chose to throw me away. You, at first, chose to claim me. This is the first time in my life I have truly been able to choose, and I want you to hear me clearly, because this choice is mine alone, and no one has forced it on me." She placed her hand on his chest, right over the heart he had spent his whole life sealing inside ice. "I choose to stay. Not because of the debt, because it is gone. Not because of my father, because he is safe. Not because of fear, because you have taken away every reason I had to be afraid. I am staying because I have seen the man you hide from the whole world. And I love that man, Roman. I am staying because I want to, and that is the only reason." Roman looked at her, and the man who had never let anyone see him weak revealed something shining at the corners of his eyes, because even thousands of lonely days put together could not equal this one sentence, the sentence he had stopped daring to hope anyone would ever say to him, that he had been chosen, not because he was frightening, but because he was worthy of being loved. Following a swift and silent counter-strategy, orchestrated by Roman and Grigor, Julian Marsh's network was dismantled, and he was turned over to federal authorities. With Julian Marsh removed from the board forever, the last shadow that had haunted Roman for 7 years finally dissolved, and for the first time in his life, he no longer had to look over his shoulder every time he walked forward. But the greatest change was not that his enemy had been defeated. It was in Roman himself. Adeline had awakened in him a longing he had not known, he still carried. The longing to live a life he would not be ashamed to pass on to the people he loved. In the months that followed, Roman accelerated the process he had begun long ago but had never had enough reason to complete. He cut away every dark branch of his empire, brought Vance Group fully into the light, turned what had once operated in the shadows into legitimate, transparent businesses, and he did it not because he feared the law, but because for the first time, he had a reason to want to become better than the man circumstance had made him. Adeline stood beside him throughout that journey, not as a silent shadow, but as a true partner, someone who dared to tell him when he was wrong, and dared to stand beside him when he was right. And as for Adeline, she finally picked up the dream she had buried so many years before. With Roman's support, she returned to the path of medicine. But she did not stop there. She used the immense resources now within her reach to establish a community medical foundation, bringing healthcare to the poor neighborhoods of Boston, places where a young nurse like her had once seen too many families lose loved ones simply because they could not afford treatment, just as she had lost her own mother. In that way, She transformed power once built from darkness into a healing light, and every life her foundation saved became another brick in the work of redeeming the past for both of them. Her father, Arthur, recovered fully and lived the years that remained to him in a peace he had not known for decades, able to witness his daughter not only survive but bloom. And then, on an autumn day, in a small, simple chapel entirely unlike the grand sanctuary where everything had begun, Adeline and Roman married each other once more. But this time there was no debt, no coercion, no 300 powerful pairs of eyes waiting for someone's collapse. Only a few people who truly loved them, real music, smiles, and two free souls who had chosen each other. When Adeline walked down the aisle this time, she remembered the first time she had walked down a similar aisle, head held high but heart broken, an abandoned bride walking like a debt waiting to be paid. The first time, she had walked down the aisle as a debt. This time, she walked as someone chosen, and more important than anything, as someone choosing for herself. And when she placed her hand in Roman's, she saw in those gray eyes that had once been cold as ice a warmth this entire city would never believe was real. The eyes of a lonely man who had finally found someone able to reach his heart, and who had allowed himself to be reached. The story of Adeline and Roman, behind all the schemes, chessboards, and secrets, is truly a story about a simple truth we sometimes forget, that no one, whether poor or powerful, deserves to be treated as an object to be exchanged, that every person deserves to be seen as a human being with dreams, pain, and dignity of their own, and that sometimes the strongest thing in the world is not the power that makes others afraid, but the kindness brave enough to see the real person hidden beneath the armor they have built to protect themselves. Adeline did not conquer Roman by fighting him, but by seeing him, truly seeing the abandoned child inside the frightening man, and that respect healed a wound no power could ever have healed. If Adeline and Roman's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that every day you can join us in listening to many more meaningful and compelling stories. We would love to know how you feel about this story, which part moved you the most, and if you were in Adeline's place, what choice you would have made. Please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moments, and we wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life every day, and a peaceful soul. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.